The quiet suburban streets of Redwood Falls rarely saw much commotion. Nestled in the heart of Oregon, this small town was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life drifted along predictably. So when 18-year-old Samantha Jones suddenly went missing in early May, it sent a ripple of shock through the community. At first, her disappearance seemed like a tragic but familiar narrative. Teenage girl, burdened by the weight of expectations, runs away from home. At least, that's what the initial investigation suggested. Samantha's parents, Albert and Lucy Jones, were devastated but not entirely surprised. After all, Samantha had always been the golden child, adored by everyone around her, including her teachers, neighbors, and even her friends' parents. But beneath the surface, there had been tensions at home, particularly with her younger brother, 17-year-old Vincent. Vincent was quiet and reserved, a stark contrast to Samantha's outgoing and bright personality. Albert and Lucy had long suspected there was some sibling rivalry, but they chalked it up to typical teenage behavior. What they didn't realize at the time was that the jealousy ran far deeper. The police investigation initially focused on finding clues that could lead to Samantha's whereabouts. Her friends were questioned, and the usual runaway spots, bus stations, friends' houses, even nearby motels were checked. Vincent was interviewed early on but raised no alarms. He appeared distraught and concerned for his sister, offering nothing more than the expected narrative: Samantha had likely run away. Weeks went by with no sign of Samantha. The Jones family plastered the town with missing person flyers, her face becoming a haunting reminder of her absence. The investigation felt increasingly futile, with no new leads emerging. Vincent played his role well, showing up to school quietly, maintaining his facade as the grieving brother. There were no significant trace of foul play, no blood, no signs of struggle. The entire situation pointed to a carefully planned runaway. However, one detail would soon unravel the carefully spun web of lies that Vincent had constructed. Samantha had asthma, a chronic condition she managed with daily use of her inhaler. As the investigation dragged on, one small but critical piece of evidence went unnoticed by many until Detective Martin Walters, a seasoned investigator, picked up on it. Samantha's asthma inhaler was still in her bedroom. Walters had been skeptical of the runaway theory from the start. Samantha's close friends painted a picture of a happy, grounded girl with future plans, college applications, relationships, a close-knit circle. None of them believed she would leave town without a trace, but the missing inhaler was what finally convinced Walters something far darker was at play. Without that inhaler, Samantha could barely make it through the day. There was no way she would have left it behind if she had truly run away. This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation. Now, instead of searching for a runaway teenager, authorities were looking at the possibility of something far worse. As the case transitioned from a missing person to a potential homicide, the spotlight began to fall on those closest to Samantha, and no one was closer to her than her brother Vincent Jones. In the days following Samantha's disappearance, life in the Jones household had grown eerily quiet. Albert and Lucy were both consumed by their own grief, searching for answers and holding on to the hope that Samantha would return. But for Vincent, each passing day was a battle to maintain the illusion of innocence. While he portrayed the image of a concerned sibling to the outside world, inside he was wrestling with the enormity of what he had done. Vincent had always felt overshadowed by his sister. Samantha was everything he wasn't: outgoing, popular, effortlessly successful. Teachers praised her, friends adored her, and even at home she seemed to soak up all the affection. Their parents, though kind to Vincent, couldn't hide their favoritism. Samantha was the star, the achiever, the one with a bright future ahead of her. Vincent, on the other hand, felt invisible. As the years passed, that sense of inadequacy festered into a deep resentment. On the night of May 2nd, tensions boiled over. It had been an ordinary evening, until a seemingly trivial argument between Vincent and Samantha erupted. No one else was home. Albert was at work, and Lucy was running errands. The argument started over something petty, but years of jealousy fueled it into something far darker. In that moment, the rage Vincent had bottled up for so long exploded. He hadn't planned to kill her, but in a fit of fury, he grabbed a heavy object, a trophy, from Samantha's desk and struck her across the head. The sound of the impact echoed through the empty house. Samantha crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around her lifeless body. Vincent stood frozen, adrenaline surging through his veins, staring at what he had done. Panic set in. His mind raced as he grappled with the horror of the situation. He knew there was no way to undo what had just happened. His immediate thought was to cover his tracks. He dragged Samantha's body into the basement, where he hastily concealed it beneath a pile of old blankets and boxes. The room was cluttered enough that he hoped it would be some time before anyone noticed the hidden corpse. Next came the task of making it seem like Samantha had run away. Vincent knew he had to act fast. He rifled through her room, gathering clothes and a few personal belongings, things that would make it look like she had packed in a hurry. He deliberately left her inhaler behind, a critical mistake that would eventually catch the attention of Detective Walters. With calculated precision, Vincent scattered some items in disarray to mimic the scene of someone hastily leaving. He even left a note, forged in Samantha's handwriting, suggesting she had grown tired of the pressures at home and needed time away. The following morning, when their mother, Lucy, returned home and discovered Samantha missing, Vincent played the role of the worried brother. He helped his parents search, feigning concern and confusion. For the next few weeks, he watched as the town grew more desperate in its search for Samantha. The whole time he knew she was lying cold in the basement, her body slowly decaying beneath the clutter. As the weeks wore on, Vincent found it harder to maintain his composure. Guilt gnawed at him, but the fear of being caught kept him silent. He stuck to his story, weaving the lie deeper into the investigation as police scoured for clues. But it was the inhaler, that small but vital detail, that would soon unravel everything. And when Detective Walters finally connected the dots, Vincent's carefully constructed facade came crashing down. As the search for Samantha stretched into its fourth week, the town of Redwood Falls was growing restless. Volunteer groups expanded their search into nearby forests and waterways, believing that if Samantha had run away, she might have ventured into the wilderness. Albert and Lucy Jones were a familiar sight in the local news, giving tearful interviews, pleading for any information about their daughter's whereabouts. Meanwhile, Vincent maintained his outward composure, playing the part of the grieving brother flawlessly. But internally, the pressure was beginning to mount. Detective Martin Walters, however, was not buying Vincent's act. The discovery of Samantha's asthma inhaler had shifted the investigation. This was no longer a missing person case, but something much more sinister. Walters had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when something didn't add up. Samantha had left without taking the one item that was essential to her survival, and that was the break Walters had been waiting for. It wasn't just the inhaler that made him suspicious. Walters began combing through every piece of evidence with fresh eyes, focusing on the family. Interviews with Samantha's friends painted a picture of a sibling relationship that had long been strained. While Samantha had been the shining star, Vincent remained in the shadows, often overlooked and undervalued. One close friend of Samantha's had even mentioned in passing that Vincent seemed to harbor a quiet, simmering resentment. Walters filed the comment away, knowing that sibling jealousy could sometimes lead to dangerous consequences. The detective began scrutinizing Vincent more closely. His behavior, while appropriate on the surface, seemed too measured, too controlled for a teenage boy whose sister had supposedly run away. The more Walters observed Vincent, the more he became convinced that the boy was hiding something. With no physical evidence tying Vincent to any crime, Walters knew he had to be patient. He began pressing harder, asking the family more detailed questions, re-examining the night of Samantha's disappearance and going over the timeline with a fine-tooth comb. Vincent, to his credit, stuck to his story, but with each passing day the cracks in his facade grew larger. One day, while interviewing Lucy Jones about her children's relationship, Walters noticed a small but telling detail. Lucy, exhausted from weeks of worry, mentioned that she had always felt something was off about Vincent's reaction to Samantha's disappearance. She wasn't sure what it was, but it gnawed at her, especially as time passed. While Lucy couldn't believe her son capable of such a monstrous act, she admitted that his detachment and coldness in the weeks following Samantha's disappearance felt unnatural. Walters seized on this. Using it as a springboard to dig deeper, he began requesting access to the Jones home under the guise of conducting routine searches for evidence. Albert and Lucy complied without hesitation, desperate for any clues that might lead them to their daughter. Vincent, however, grew increasingly anxious. The walls were closing in, and he knew it was only a matter of time before his secret was exposed. During one of these routine visits, Walters asked to see the basement, where Vincent spent most of his time. As the detective descended the narrow staircase, the air felt different, stale, musty, and oppressive. The cluttered basement was a chaotic jumble of old furniture, forgotten boxes, and discarded items. But amidst the disarray, Walters noticed something unusual, a faint, sickly odor that he recognized immediately. It was the unmistakable scent of decay. His heart quickened as he carefully examined the room. Vincent hovered nearby, his body language tense and defensive. Walters could feel the boy's eyes on him as he moved around the basement, pretending to look for clues related to Samantha's disappearance. But he wasn't looking for clues anymore. He was searching for something far more sinister. At the far end of the room, a pile of old blankets and boxes caught Walter's attention. It wasn't out of place in the messy basement, but something about the way it was arranged struck him as deliberate. With deliberate calm, Walters motioned for one of the forensic officers to approach. Slowly, they began removing the blankets, and what they uncovered beneath them sent a shiver down Walter's spine. It was Samantha. Her body, though decomposed, was unmistakable. She had been hidden there all along, right under the family's feet. Walter stood up slowly, his gaze shifting from the body to Vincent, whose face had gone ashen. The boy didn't say a word, but the look of horror in his eyes was all the confession Walters needed. The lie Vincent had lived for the past month had finally unraveled, and with it, any chance of escaping the truth. The discovery of Samantha's body changed everything. The media frenzy that had focused on the missing girl now shifted to something far darker. News outlets across Oregon ran stories of the tragic sibling murder, and Redwood Falls became a hotbed of speculation. The town, once peaceful, was now steeped in disbelief and horror. The forensic team confirmed what Walters had already suspected: Samantha had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. The object? A trophy from her own room, one of her many accolades for academic excellence. It was a cruel irony that the very symbol of Samantha's success had become the instrument of her death. Vincent Jones was taken into custody, his demeanor eerily calm, despite the gravity of the situation. As detectives questioned him, the full story of what had happened that fateful night began to emerge. What had started as a petty argument between siblings had spiraled out of control, fueled by years of simmering jealousy. Vincent had been unable to contain his resentment any longer, and in a moment of rage he had lashed out with deadly force. What made the case even more chilling was Vincent's calculated efforts to cover up the crime. After killing Samantha, he had hidden her body in the basement, knowing that the cluttered space would buy him time. He had staged her disappearance, creating a convincing narrative that she had run away. The note he forged in her handwriting had thrown investigators off his trail for weeks, allowing him to live a lie while the town searched desperately for his sister. The pressure of maintaining the charade had taken its toll on Vincent. While outwardly he had appeared calm and collected, inside he was crumbling. The weight of the secret had become unbearable, but he had been too deep into the lie to turn back. As the investigation into Samantha's murder progressed, Vincent Jones' fragile web of lies quickly unraveled. In the days following his arrest, Redwood Falls became a spectacle of media coverage, with reporters camped outside the Jones family home and news vans lining the street. The neighbors and former classmates of Samantha and Vincent were thrust into the spotlight, providing sound bites about the siblings who, up until now, had seemed like a typical family. But now, the town saw them as something far darker. Detective Martin Walters continued to piece together the events that led to Samantha's death. With the discovery of her body in the basement, the case moved swiftly. Forensic experts provided damning evidence that aligned with Vincent's handsel-clarkaged. Blood spatter patterns on the floor beneath, where Samantha's body had been concealed, and traces of her blood on the trophy Vincent had used, left little room for doubt. During Vincent's interrogation, he initially remained silent. There was no emotion in his expression, no hint of remorse, just a quiet acceptance of what was coming. But under pressure, Vincent finally broke down. He revealed what had driven him to that terrible moment: the years of being compared to Samantha, the constant overshadowing by his sister, who had always been seen as the favorite. His confession, though cold and factual, exposed a deep, festering resentment that had been building for as long as he could remember. For years, Samantha had been the golden child, the one everyone loved and celebrated. Her academic achievements, her vibrant social life, and her effortless charm made her the center of attention. Vincent, by contrast, felt invisible. No matter what he did, it was never enough to pull him out of his sister's shadow. The resentment simmered beneath the surface, turning into something far more dangerous. On the night of the murder, what started as a typical sibling argument had escalated rapidly. Vincent described how Samantha had been dismissive of him, something that had always infuriated him. But this time, it was different. Her words struck a nerve, and something inside him snapped. He grabbed the closest object, the heavy trophy that symbolized everything he hated about her success, and brought it crashing down on her head. The sudden violence shocked even him. In the moments that followed, Vincent described standing over his sister's body, frozen in disbelief at what he had done. His immediate instinct had been to cover it up, to hide the evidence and pretend it never happened. For a while it worked, but as the investigation dragged on, the strain of keeping up the lie became too much. The guilt gnawed at him, manifesting in sleepless nights and a growing paranoia that the truth would inevitably come out. The details of Vincent's confession painted a harrowing picture of sibling rivalry taken to its most extreme conclusion. But there was one aspect of the story that puzzled Walters. Why hadn't Vincent fled? After all, he had managed to keep the secret for nearly a month, fooling not only his parents but also the entire town. Instead of running, Vincent had stayed, living under the same roof as his sister's decomposing body, going about his daily life as if nothing had happened. Walters believed that Vincent's decision to remain was rooted in something deeper than fear. Perhaps in his own twisted way, Vincent felt that he had won. For the first time, he had escaped Samantha's shadow, albeit in the most horrific way imaginable. And now everyone saw him not as the forgotten sibling, but as something much worse, a murderer. And the news of Vincent's confession shattered the already fragile Jones family. Albert and Lucy, who had clung to the hope that Samantha was still alive somewhere, were now confronted with the unimaginable reality that their son had killed their daughter. It was a grief that defied understanding, losing both children in such a brutal and irreversible way. Lucy, in particular, was devastated. She had always been close to Samantha, sharing in her successes and proudly watching her daughter blossom into adulthood. The realization that Vincent had been carrying so much hatred, so much anger, and that she had missed the signs, broke her in a way that no one could have predicted. As following Vincent's arrest, she barely spoke, retreating into herself as the weight of her loss consumed her. Albert, though equally heartbroken, tried to keep things together for his wife, but even he struggled with the enormity of the situation. He had never imagined that the sibling rivalry he had seen growing up between Samantha and Vincent could lead to something so catastrophic. Though looking back, there had been small moments, arguments, tension, little slights that he had dismissed as typical teenage behavior. Now he saw them for what they were, warning signs of a deep resentment that had gone unchecked for far too long. As the parents of both the victim and the perpetrator, Albert and Lucy found themselves in an impossible situation. The town, once supportive and sympathetic, now looked at them with a mixture of pity and suspicion. How could they not have known? How could they have raised a son capable of such violence? The once close-knit community began to distance itself, and soon the Joneses became pariahs in their own home. The media coverage only added to the strain. Reporters hounded the Jones family for statements, digging into their past and searching for any clues that could explain what had happened inside their household. Old family photos of a smiling Samantha and Vincent circulated in the news, contrasting with the grim reality that had unfolded. For the public, the story was one of betrayal and tragedy, a golden child lost at the hands of her own brother. But for Albert and Lucy, it was a nightmare that they couldn't escape. As they watched their son face the justice system, they were forced to grapple with the question that haunted them both. Had they failed their children? Could they have prevented this if they had been more attentive, more aware of the growing animosity between their son and daughter? In the weeks leading up to Vincent's trial, the Jones household became a shell of its former self. The laughter, the warmth, and the love that had once defined their family had been replaced by silence and despair. Albert and Lucy barely spoke, and when they did, it was often through tears. The home that had once been filled with life now felt haunted by the absence of their children, one buried in the ground, the other sitting in a jail cell awaiting his fate. As the legal process moved forward, the community began to heal in its own way, but for the Jones family there would be no healing. The scars left by Vincent's actions were too deep, too raw to ever fully recover from, and they had lost everything: their daughter, their son, and the life they once knew. And in the quiet aftermath of the tragedy, they were left with only questions and the hollow, aching grief of lives irreparably torn apart. The trial of Vincent Jones was swift, yet excruciating for those involved. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a premeditated act, citing Vincent's careful attempts to cover up the murder, the staged runaway, and the weeks of deceit that followed. They argued that while the murder may not have been planned for long, the execution and subsequent cover-up showed Vincent's clear intent to hide his crime, which constituted malice and forethought. Vincent's defense, however, told a different story. They focused on his psychological state, pointing to years of emotional neglect and the pressure of living in his sister's shadow. They didn't deny that Vincent had killed Samantha, but they argued that it was a crime of passion, an uncontrollable outburst fueled by a lifetime of being overlooked and devalued by his family. His lawyer argued that this was not the act of a cold-blooded killer, but of a deeply troubled teenager who had snapped in a moment of blinding rage. Throughout the trial, Vincent remained stoic, rarely showing any emotion. He sat silently as witnesses were called, including his parents, Albert and Lucy. Their testimony was heartbreaking. Lucy broke down on the stand, struggling to reconcile the image of her son as a murderer with the boy she had raised. Albert was more composed, but his pain was just as evident. He recounted moments of sibling tension that, in retrospect, felt like warning signs they had ignored. They hadn't seen Vincent's isolation, his growing resentment, until it was too late. The key piece of evidence, however, was Vincent's own confession. The jury heard his cold, matter-of-fact account of the night he killed his sister, the way he had hidden her body, and the way he had forged the narrative of her disappearance. The prosecutor used Vincent's own words against him, describing how he had callously lived under the same roof with his dead sister, manipulating his grieving parents while the town searched for a girl who was never coming home. But it was Detective Martin Walters' testimony that had the most impact. Walters detailed the investigation from the moment they found Samantha's inhaler to the discovery of her body in the basement. He also spoke about the chilling calm Vincent had displayed during the investigation, a calm that Walters believed showed a lack of remorse. But it was when Walters described his belief that the murder stemmed from deep-seated resentment that the courtroom fell silent. The detective believed that in killing Samantha, Vincent had finally broken free of her shadow in the most horrifying way imaginable. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, taking into account Vincent's age and the circumstances of the crime, handed down a sentence of 25 years to life. Vincent would be eligible for parole after 25 years, but the enormity of his crime would likely keep him behind bars for much longer. As the sentence was read, Vincent's face remained impassive. There were no tears, no outbursts, just the same blank expression that had marked the entire trial. His parents wept quietly in the gallery, holding each other as they faced the finality of the situation. Their son, now a convicted murderer, would spend the majority of his life in prison. Their daughter, gone forever, had been reduced to a memory. The courtroom emptied, leaving the Jones family to grapple with their new reality. The trial had been the closing chapter of their nightmare, but the pain of their loss would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The years following Vincent Jones' conviction were marked by a somber quiet in Redwood Falls. The town, which had been rocked by the tragedy, slowly returned to normal, though the memory of Samantha's murder lingered in the air. People moved on, as they always do, but for those close to the case, the scars remained. Albert and Lucy Jones sold their house not long after the trial. The home, once filled with the laughter and lives of their 2 children, had become a place of unbearable sorrow. They moved to a smaller town in the hopes of escaping the shadow of what had happened, but they never truly healed. Their marriage, once strong, faltered under the weight of grief and guilt. They stayed together out of a shared loss, but the light in their relationship had dimmed, replaced by an overwhelming sense of failure. Lucy, haunted by the memories of her children, fell into a deep depression. She spent her days in therapy, trying to make sense of what had gone wrong, what signs she had missed, the guilt that she had favored Samantha, unknowingly fueling the resentment that had consumed Vincent, ate away at her. Albert, ever the pragmatist, threw himself into work, but even that couldn't fill the void by the loss of both his children, one to death and the other to prison. Detective Martin Walters retired from the police force 2 years after the case. Samantha's murder had been the most difficult case of his career, not because of the complexity, but because of the tragedy woven into every aspect of it. He often thought about the Jones family, wondering if they would ever find peace. He doubted it. Some wounds never fully heal. Vincent, now an inmate in a state penitentiary, became something of a ghost. Inside prison walls, he was just another young man with a ruined life. The media lost interest in him, and over time, even the town of Redwood Falls stopped speaking his name. His story, though once headline news, became just another cautionary tale of a life ruined by jealousy and rage. Yet for Vincent, life behind bars brought its own form of quiet reflection. Alone with his thoughts, he replayed the events of that fateful night over and over in his mind, wondering how things had gone so wrong. There were moments of regret, though he rarely expressed them, and moments where the anger that had driven him to kill flickered once more. But mostly there was just the heavy, inescapable reality of what he had done. He had destroyed not only his sister's life but his own, along with the lives of his parents, who now lived in the wreckage of his actions. Samantha, forever 18, became a distant memory to the world outside Redwood Falls, but in the hearts of her parents she remained ever present, a beacon of the life they had lost. Her gravestone, visited less frequently over the years, stood as a quiet reminder of a life cut short and of the dangers that sometimes lurk within the very people we think we know best. In the end, the story of Vincent and Samantha Jones became a dark chapter in the town's history. A chilling reminder of how far the flames of jealousy and resentment can burn, and for those who had lived through it, the lesson was clear. Beneath the surface of even the most ordinary families, there can lie secrets too painful to confront until it's too late.